So now we're going to have a talk about England, and about the foundation of the State of Israel. So, as you know, the State of Israel didn't exist until 1948, and before then, up until 1917, the Turks ruled over all this area. They ruled over Syria. They ruled over Palestine. They had hegemony over Saudi Arabia, over all of the Persian Gulf area. At one stage, they also ruled over Egypt, but the British, in effect, took control of Egypt away from them. But they were in this area. They also ruled had a powerful kingdom, and they were the rulers. And then in First World War, they joined the Turks and the Austro-Hungarians against their allies, and they fought a war. Incidentally, one of my grandfathers fought against the Turks in Gallipoli. He was a liaison officer between a French contingent and the British forces there. And his name was Leo Jacobi. Anyway, the British issued the Balfour Declaration just before they conquered the land of Palestine from the Turks. And so we had a question: why did the British do this? Why did the British involve themselves in this? In this declaration, they said that His Majesty's government looks with favour upon the establishment of a Jewish home in the land of Israel, and so on, and gave an outline of building up a Jewish settlement, and that is what they did. And their control over the area was recognised by the League of Nations. The League of Nations is a forerunner to the United Nations. And they began to build up the infrastructure in the land of Israel. Then the Jews come in, they built the roads, they ruled the country, they protected the Jews from Arab marauders, and they built schools and roads, and also they enabled the Jews to invest in the region. The Jews got money from America, got money from Jewish communities all over the world to help the settlers, to help the land of Israel, and they built it up. And it became a more or less successful community. And this continued up until 1936, 1939, when the Arabs had a revolt. And then this revolt, the Jews suffered, but the British put the revolt down, and they killed a lot of Arabs, and they wounded a lot of Arabs, and there were much more harsh against the Arabs than the Jews ever were. And in effect, this was a good thing, because in this way, they more or less enabled the Jews later on to beat the Arabs who lived in the area and concentrate on defeating the Arab armies who came in and attacked them from outside the country. But even so, this was after the Second World War. After the Second World War, there were Jews who were in displaced person camps throughout Europe. The Jews have been killed. More than 6 million Jews have been killed. Many Jews have been turned into refugees and nowhere to go. They were wandering around displaced person camps. They couldn't return to the places they had been expelled from. In some cases they tried to, and the local people killed them or drove them away. There were a lot of incidents like that, and so they were more or less in Germany in displaced persons camps waiting for somewhere to go. America took in a lot, and eventually a lot of them also came to the land of Israel, but it took time. It took time, and there was friction between the Jewish establishment and the Jews in the land of Israel and the British rulers. And in the end, the British left. Nevertheless, so they have many studies on this, and the situation, attitude of the British changed from one time to another, from one ruler to another, one soldier to another. On the whole, the British were, despite what others say, were pro-Jewish and helped the Jews, but there were numerous exceptions. That was the way how things go. There are numerous exceptions, and these exceptions cause bad feeling. So at all events, our understanding is, on the whole, the British were very positive, and a lot of Jewish historians also agree with that now. Now, the question arose on a historical on a list discussing historical matters concerning why did the British issue the Balfour Declaration in the first place. In other words, when the British were, remember the British were in Turkey. Sorry, the Turks were in Turkey, and they ruled over Syria, and they ruled over Palestine, and the British were coming up. They're coming up out of Egypt. They conquered Sinai, they conquered Gaza, and they went on and conquered Jerusalem, and they conquered the rest of the country. And then they issued the Balfour Declaration, or just before they completed their conquest, they issued the Balfour Declaration. So the question is, why did they issue this declaration? So the answer is they were about to take control of the place, and it wasn't an empty entity. There were people living there. The French were interested in setting up colonies in the area, and they did. They took over Lebanon. They took over Syria for a while. They would have wanted part of Palestine. And so the British also had interests. They also wanted to establish it, to enlarge their colonial empire. They wanted to protect the Suez Canal. They had interest too in the area. Also, they were afraid of Russia. There was Russian Revolution and the communist revolutions all over the world, or communist agitations. And also they wanted to protect oil resources, and they had many had the idea that also in the land of Israel, all producing petroleum would be found. So they had all kinds of considerations. And in addition to that, there was a Jewish lobby in Britain, a Jewish lobby in Britain headed by Chaim Weizmann. And he was a Jewish activist, and he went around. He was a very important person. He went around and he talked to everyone. That's what he did most of the time. Just go and talk to people, but talk to important people and be friends with them, and befriend them and talk to them, and convince them that the Jews needed their own country, and that the land of Israel should be the new country for the Jews. And many of them became convinced of what he was saying, and they also had their own reasons, their own inner considerations for this. So we have these factors working on the British. Also America, in America they also had a Jewish lobby. America also wanted to do something to help the Jews. We should remember that before the First World War there had been pogroms, there had been persecutions in Russia and Eastern Europe, and Jewish refugees have been all over the place, and had been horrible things have been happening. And there was a feeling that the Jews should have their own country. The Jews should have somewhere to go, and Palestine would be the best place for them. This was also a factor. And there was also altruism. The British had altruistic inclinations, motivations. It wasn't all plunder. It wasn't all making money and exploiting people. Eventually, they wanted to do the right thing. We can, for instance, for example, the slave trade. Have the slave trade. Slave trade was taking slaves from Africa to America, first to North America, then to South America. And the British were major players in the slave trade starting from 1662 up until 1807. Around 3 million Africans were taken from Africa to the Americas in ships by the British. Okay. But everyone was doing it. The Africans were selling their own people as slaves. Everyone was selling slaves. Everyone was buying slaves. It was an accepted custom at that time. And everyone was doing it, and the Africans were selling their own people and facilitating the slave trade. And even now in Africa, you have slaves everywhere, all over the place. And they still sell slaves. In North Africa, they have marketplaces for slaves now. So it wasn't, and there aren't any British there. It had nothing to do with them. And even so, even though the British had been active in bringing all these slaves over, there were always people in Britain who were against it, who agitated against it. And this agitation, this playing on the conscience, on what's the right thing to do, was an ongoing phenomenon until eventually the British decided to stop it. In 1907, they stopped slave trade, and they stopped. And then shortly afterwards, they abolished slavery throughout the empire, and then they stopped slave on the seas. They prevented any nation from transporting slave ships across the sea, across the oceans. And they also went into African states and liberated the slaves, and went after the slave traders and hunted them down. And thousands of British soldiers were killed doing this, wiping out the slave trade. And why were they doing this? They believed that they had to come to the conclusion that the slave trade was wrong. So in other words, the British, despite everything, could have changes of heart and did have genuine altruistic feelings of doing what was right. So too concerning the Jews, they had this feeling to do the best thing for the Jews, to help the Jews, because the Jews needed help. And the best way to do this was to give them the land of Israel. In addition to that, there were others who also thought it might help British interests. There might be oil there. It might give the Jews, might be grateful to them. The Jews in America might help Britain. And in all different ways, Britain might benefit from it. But it doesn't mean that doesn't take away from the genuine altruism that a person might have. No, you might be helping someone out, someone who's having a hard time, you're helping him out, and you have a business, so you don't mind. You don't mind thinking that maybe if he's successful, maybe he'll come back and be a customer of yours, help you out, repay you. You don't know, maybe you'll get it back some way or other, maybe you won't. But this is natural. So too, this was a British experience. So this is what we have. Points. We also, two things that are important to us. Two things that are important to us. That in Britain you had the Bible. Okay, since the time of Henry VIII, Henry VIII was broken away from the Church of Rome, and he had a Bible set up in every church, changed on a kind of on a wooden stand, and anyone could come and read it, even though most people couldn't read, but it was available to those who could. And many people did read and did learn to read, and the knowledge of the Bible spread, and even before then they did have a certain degree of biblical consciousness. And the Bible, Hebrew Bible, that is the Old Testament, it gives us this, the following impression. It says that the land of Canaan is promised for an eternal possession to the Israelite nation. The land of Canaan is an eternal possession for the Israelites, for the Hebrews. It is contingent on keeping at least part of the law. And if they sin, they may be dispossessed and exiled, but they will come back. And they will receive the land back. That's what the Bible says. And also the Bible emphasizes over and over again that the land basically belongs to them. So far, so good. But despite this, no matter what happens, they will return. And along with this, a certain attitude is inculcated that it's a good thing in the eyes of God Almighty. It's a good thing that the people of Israel dwell in the land of Israel. God wants it. It is a good thing. Therefore, he implores them not to sin and not be exiled. But in itself, it is a good thing, and it is a good deed to help the Jews come and live in the land of Israel. Cyrus the king of Persia, enabled the Jews to return from Babylon to their land. He was a good king. He is praised for doing this. And so the idea grew up that maybe we should do the same. Maybe we should help the Jews go back to their land. And Wikipedia also talks about this, and this gave rise to what is called Christian Zionism in the 1600s. And there were certain Christians who believed that the Jews should be ingathered, the Jews should be helped. They also said that the Jews should be allowed to come back to England. And for many of them, the idea of the Jews coming back to England was a prelude. First bring them back to England, then help them move across the seas in ships and conquer the Holy Land and set up their own kingdom. And so this was a widely held sentiment. Books were written about it, and famous people spoke of it. The proposals were made to the government authorities that they should do something about it. Also, they got in contact with the Jews, they got in contact with other people, and they were thinking about doing something or trying to do something from a very early beginning. Even Isaac Newton, the famous scientist, he predicted the Jews should return to Palestine. They would rebuild Jerusalem in the late 19th century, he said. And they would rebuild the 3rd century in the 20th or 21st century, that is in our time. It hasn't happened yet, but he said it would. And there are others like that. Some of these proposals, they spoke about doing this as a preparation or in addition to converting all the Jews to Christianity. But this idea of converting the Jews to Christianity was not held by all of them, and it was an idea that all Christians at that time held. All Christians at the time held, religious Christians had the idea that they should do what they can to convert the Jews to Christianity. And some of those who connected it with helping the Jews rebuild their land were not doing something exceptional. But there were those who didn't even think of this, didn't put so much emphasis on this, didn't even talk about it, and were those who even thought the Jews should not become Christian. And some of them became Jewish. They converted to Judaism. They went to Holland. And there were among the Protestant Puritans or people like this, and there were others. And in addition to this, you also had those from the 1600s who believed they were descended from the tribes of Israel. This was the beginning of British Israel, or this was a development of British Israel ideas. And John Sadler is very important in this. He was a friend of Cromwell, who's a government appointee, and he wrote a book about it, and he also spoke of it. And it was the idea that the Jews were blood brothers of the same descent as the British was also associated with the idea of bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel on the whole. So at the beginning, the idea of associating the Jews, of saying that we descend from lost tribes of Israel, and also wanting the Jews to build their own land, early Zionism, were connected. They were linked together. Later on in the course of time, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish elements came in and began to twist and pervert the meanings and put up other ideas, but at the beginning this is how it was. And these ideas existed, and they were associated with different movements, different associations. But in addition to this, they were also a common property. A lot of people had these ideas, even people who had once been Christians were no longer Christians. They had the idea that they descended from the tribes of Israel. They had the idea that the Jews should have their own land. And there were three people who were very important in the history of Zionism, of the state of Israel. And each one of them believed that they were also part of the 10 tribes of Israel. So the three people we mentioned were Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, in the First World War. He was important. He was an intelligence officer, and he helped the British conquer the land of Israel. And he was also an important scientist, ornithologist. There was an expert on birds. And he also believed in British Israel. So also we had Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Patterson. In the First World War, they had Jewish units fighting alongside the British in their own units. And Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson was in charge of them. And after the end of the war, he still remained friendly with them. He was a strong Zionist. He advised Zionist activists such as Zev Jabotinsky, who was a good friend of his. And he too believed in British Israel. Another person who was very important was Orde Charles Wingate in the Second World War. He came from a deeply religious family. He knew the Bible, read the Bible very often. He was no longer really a Christian, but he believed in the Bible very much, and he also believed in British Israel, and he helped train the Jews in the land of Palestine, which was then under British rule. He helped train them, helped build up the Haganah, laid the foundations for the IDF, and he was known as Yadid, the friend of the Jews. The Jews referred to him as the friend. He was their friend, and he helped train soldiers to later help build up the Jewish forces, and his methods and doctrines were somewhat unorthodox, unusual, and they applied in the IDF, and he was very important. And he too believed in the British Afro-Muslim tribes of Israel. He's also important historically for other reasons. When the war broke out, he thought he was too Jewish to remain in the area, so they transferred. So he was sent to Ethiopia, helped the Ethiopians defeat the Italians, break free from the Italians, and after that he went to Burma, where he set up the commando units, the Chindits, who helped break the rule of Japan in Asia, and helped us win the Second World War. There's some controversy as to how important he really was, but he was important even not only for his military successes, also because of the psychological effect he had, the good he did in that way. And so here we have people who believe that the British descent from the tribes of Israel, who were friendly to the Jews, helped the Jews, and helped Zionism. So this is of interest, and it also reflects on the probable ancestry, that the idea of the lost 10 tribes did become the British and related peoples. This is an old idea. It's a well-entrenched idea. A lot of people believe in it, and on the whole, its effects have been very positive. And it's worth knowing this, because now you find all kinds of crazy peoples who also accepted versions of this idea, and they give it a bad name. You've probably all heard of the Aryan nations. The Aryan nations are criminals. They're in the jails. They're Nazis, and they kill people. And they're also against the Jews, and also believe they're from the 10 tribes, and all the white people from the 10 tribes and so on. And they give us a bad name only because they also believe that they're from the 10 tribes. And you have other groups like that who also are liable to give anyone who believes that they're from the 10 tribes, to the British and the related peoples are from the 10 tribes. They're all liable to get a bad name because of this association, which historically is incorrect. Because on the whole, believers in the 10 tribes, as we believe, as we teach, have historically done a lot of good for the Jewish people and for the cause of Zionism and for the world in general. So that is what we have. If one has any comments and so on, we'll hear them out.
It's back to Mandalay. It's about Burma and Wingate going to Burma. It's an interesting story about him.
Oh, yeah.
And how he was sent there. It's an old book called by Lowell Lowell Thomas.
So you have it. He was a very important person. He helped the Allies win the Second World War. He was a hero, an exceptional person in a lot of ways.